I was a young man when the first funeral happened. I remember it well, not just because it was the first time I'd seen that woman, but because it was the start of something that would haunt our village for many years. It was Nena, the wife of our late chief, Izinwosu. We'd always known she was strong, a woman who carried herself with dignity, even after her husband passed away. But on that day, on the day we buried her, something strange happened. The sky had been cloudy all day, and the wind stirred the leaves with an anxious rustle. As the men of the village carried her casket to the grave, something caught my eye. At the edge of the gathering, near the old palm tree by the village square, stood a woman. I don't remember seeing her arrive. She wasn't from Uvuma. None of us knew her. She wore a long, flowing black dress and a scarf that covered most of her face. Her posture was stiff, but I saw her hand trembling. I thought it was just the wind at first, but as the ceremony went on, I noticed her eyes, dark and full of sorrow, as if she had been crying for days. At first, I thought she was just another mourner who had wandered in from another village, but she stayed silent, never joining in the chorus of weeping women. It was strange, you know. Most mourners weep loudly, crying for the dead and sharing their grief with the others. But she stood there, just watching, her gaze fixed on Nena's grave. The chief's sons didn't notice her, too busy with the rites. But I did. I was a witness, so I watched everything carefully. I looked at the other villagers, expecting one of them to speak up, but no one seemed bothered by her presence. In fact, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the village elder, Okwara, even nodded at her, as though he knew her. But what struck me most was the way she cried. It wasn't like the others. There was no wailing, no loud sobs, just quiet tears that seemed to never stop. Later that evening, I heard an older woman in the village, Mama Ifeoma, speaking about her. "She's the one," she whispered to another elder, "the one who comes with death." At first, I thought it was just a rumor. But when Nena's son, Ugo, fell ill a week after the funeral, the village began to speak more openly about the woman. They said she had followed every funeral for as long as anyone could remember, showing up unexpectedly, weeping silently, and then disappearing. People said she was cursed, an omen. They said she was the spirit of someone lost long ago, trapped in an endless mourning, unable to rest until the last of her kin was buried. But no one knew who she was. The strangest part came after Ugo recovered. That's when the whispers started. The woman returned, not to mourn, but to sit quietly on the edge of the village square. She would not speak to anyone, but always seemed to be waiting for something or someone. Days passed, and her presence became a kind of ritual. Every funeral in Uvuma, whether it was for a child, an elder, or a young woman, she would be there. She would stand or sit by the palm tree, silent, watching. I spoke to a few elders, trying to learn more, but each time I asked, I was met with silence. No one had seen her before, and no one knew where she came from. And yet, after every funeral, there was always sickness or misfortune that followed. Then, it happened again. It was the funeral of our dear neighbor, Nkiru, a strong woman who had raised 6 children. The day was bright, the air thick with the smell of earth and flowers. The mourners gathered in the village square, and we watched as her family, led by her eldest son, marched to the grave. And there, standing again at the same spot by the palm tree, was the woman. But this time, there was something different. When the funeral rites were finished and the family had left the grave, I stayed behind to pay my respects. As I walked past the woman, I saw her face, barely covered by a scarf. Her eyes were bloodshot, and there were lines of grief etched deep into her skin. But it wasn't just sorrow that filled her gaze, it was anger. She turned to me as I passed, and for the first time, she spoke. "Tell them," she whispered, "that they will not be free until they honor the dead." Her voice was cold, like the wind that blows from the hills at night. Before I could ask her what she meant, she vanished, just as she had always done, disappearing into the shadows of the village, her footsteps no longer leaving any trace on the earth. I never saw her again. After that day, the village elders convened in secret after that, and they said that the spirit of the woman had been wronged long ago. They spoke of an old story, one that was passed down in whispers. It was said that her family had been unjustly buried without the proper rites, and their spirits had been wandering ever since. They told me to stop asking questions and to let the dead rest. But I couldn't forget the look in her eyes, or the warning she left behind. I am an elder now, and I've told my children to never forget that strange mourner. There are some things that the living should not ignore. Death is not just an end, it's a beginning, a start of something we may not understand, but must respect. I share this story not as a warning, but as a reminder. Sometimes, the spirits that walk among us are not there to harm us. They are there because they are waiting for us to remember the proper ways of the ancestors, to honor them as we should. Perhaps one day, when I am gone, someone will stand by that same palm tree and remember her, just as I do.